everyone. I'm Robert Peake, and welcome to another Change Your Game with GTD podcast. I'm here, as always, with Todd Brown.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Todd. So the purpose of this is to elucidate some of the getting things done GTD methodology, specifically as it applies to you and your life and how you not only work, putting your nose to the grindstone, but think about your work, backing up from all of that. To try and work a little smarter, more elegantly, to be a bit more effective in what you do in terms of how you've defined that, how you define what effectiveness is and what it means for you, not only in your work, but in the richness of your life. So we've been doing this for a while, and one of the fun things is that listeners, viewers, send in questions. They comment on what we've talked about previously, and they're curious about whether we could address a particular topic. One caught our eye as it was coming through the email stream from Just. Who's a project manager and a longtime GTDer, really having a lot of success with the stuff that has really sort of, in his mind, clear finish lines, as I understand it, but wanting to know a little bit more about the squishy stuff, the stuff that's maybe a little more interesting to define in terms of what a successful outcome would be, things that are more on the kind of in the want to category, but also things he mentioned like acquisition strategy or team vision, right? Stuff that you don't necessarily throw onto a Gantt chart, just tick off the bits along the way in a real predictable manner. Todd, your initial thoughts on the so-called squishy stuff out there?
Yeah, I think this comes up for folks a lot. Sometimes if you just think about what we recommend by way of the core activities in planning, right? So we talk about the power of focusing on outcomes, defining projects in most cases is what that means. What does the finish line look like? The finish line looks like I've got a new car. The finish line looks like I've got my spring holiday plan. The finish line looks like I've got a new team member hired, right? And then we talk about the other element of planning that's sort of in the core of the GTD methodology is next actions, right? So what is the very next physical, visible thing I'm going to do to move this forward? And I think for a lot of the things in our lives, that's enough planning. And when I say enough, my guideline for whether I or one of my clients have done enough planning is this off my mind for now? Which is something that actually I heard the quote, "Is this off my mind?" originally from David Allen, and I'm pretty sure it was you, Robert, who added that little tag, which I find hugely valuable. Is this off my mind for now? In other words, have I finished the thinking about it for now? That's not to say that when it comes time to actually execute on the action that I won't think about it then, of course, but is it off my mind for now? So as I say, those two questions, right? What's the desired outcome, or what's the project? And then secondly, what's the next action? For a lot of the things in our lives, that's enough, right? That's enough planning, and we'll probably feel like, okay, my brain has relaxed now about that thing. But as you say, not everything falls into that category. Sometimes, if you've got a really big outcome, and when I say big, it could be big in terms of scale. It could be big in terms of your perception of its risk, in terms of who's looking and what could go wrong. It could be big in terms of the amount of money that you're investing, or your organization is investing, or potentially investing in it. There are a number of ways you can sort of define big. But in all of those cases, it could also be just very long term. It could be quite a long project. And in those cases, I find that the next action question and the what's the outcome question, what's the project definition, those are interesting, but they don't quite get us to the point where we've gotten those bigger things completely off our minds. And that's where I think we need to think more broadly about how much planning do I need to do in order to get this thing off my mind? How much thinking through, and what are the tools I could use? What are the tools I could use to help do that additional planning, again, beyond the next action and outcome question? And GTD offers a lot here. I'm sort of feeling the need to get your thoughts here, Robert. So if you in those cases where you do have those bigger things, what kinds of tools do you bring to bear? What kinds of approaches out of the GTD methodology are helpful for you?
Well, that's such a great point, Todd, that there are always tools, right? There are always ways. For me, one of the biggest ones for the big things is something we call the natural planning model, because it really helps to tease out some of the components that help you, help me anyway, get to that level of comfort, that level of this is off my mind for now. And actually, I think it may have been Meg Edwards, credit where credit's due, that first taught me the for now component. But the idea there is just that you can comfortably shift your focus to something else, whether it's the next item to clarify and organize out of your mind sweep or email, or the next project to engage with. You can comfortably change focus and not feel like I might be missing something here. So it's the antidote or corollary to we might be missing something. And for the big stuff, the natural planning model is a great way to make sure you're not really missing anything, because it's a really, I don't want to say structured, but formalized way of doing brainstorming, spotting gaps, really getting your head around all of the implications of what this bigger thing is. What's also wonderful about the natural planning model is that it's really great for interfacing with others as a common framework for doing this kind of thinking. You know, several brains are better than one always, if you can get those brains working together rather than kind of pulling against each other. So this is a way to align on here's how we're going to think this through, right? We're going to be thinking about, you know, what's the bigger purpose, what are the potential risks, what are all the components, who needs to be informed about all of this kind of stuff. We're going to lay this out together, spot the gaps, make sure that we've got a complete and coherent understanding of what success means. It also creates a lot of buy-in for those people that are actually going to be, you know, pulling the tractor forward to do this stuff. So, you know, and the ones that you mentioned, acquisition strategy, team vision, those kind of things are also generally best done as a collaborative kind of thing. The kickoff, as well as the execution of achieving this, is best done. Best done collaboratively. So natural planning model is a big one for me for the really big stuff and for the collaborative stuff. What about you, Todd? What other strategies do you take when you look at something and you go, the outcome isn't really self-evident. This feels squishy. How do you help yourself de-squish?
Yeah, let's just dwell on the planning model for a minute because I think it's a great call. Just for those of you that aren't familiar with the planning model, let's just give you a very high level overview of it. So, and by the way, it's described in detail in David Allen's first book. So, in Getting Things Done: The Art of Stress-Free Productivity, you'll find it in chapter 3 of that book, and David goes through it step by step. But what the natural planning model does is it gives you a little bit of light structure. That's kind of the way I think about it. It's not a heavy, it's not one of these sort of purpose-built industrial scale planning models. It allows you very flexibly and very effectively to make sure that you've thought through all of the elements of your project that might be relevant. So so basically, the first thing that it's a model in stages, a bit like the workflow model. And the first element of the model is: have I understood the purpose? Do I know why I'm doing this project? I say in my seminars, the level 2 seminars where we cover this in detail, I say, okay, hands up, who believes their time is valuable? Right? Pretty much every hand in the room goes up, and then I say, okay, well, then answer the question: why are you bothering to do anything at all? Right? What's the purpose? Are you trying to solve a problem? Is there an opportunity? And then we talk about the principles. Okay, so what are the rules you're going to play by? Who's on the team? Is there a budget? Is it due by a particular time? What are the sort of rules of engagement of the project? Then we encourage people to look at the desired outcome. What does done look like? And our thinking there is that it's helpful, especially for these bigger, squishier things, to think through the outcome, not just in terms of your own outcome, what does this give me, but also what are the outcomes of the other potential stakeholders, right? So draw a very rich picture of what the finish line looks like for everybody who has something to do with this project. Now, having identified that outcome, what the brain starts very naturally to do is brainstorm, because in essence, what you've done by identifying that outcome is you've acknowledged that there's a gap between where you are and where you want to be. And in that moment, your brain very naturally goes, okay, well, that's where I want to be. I'm not there right now. What could be relevant that would get me from where I am now to where I want to go to? And that's again, that's where brainstorming comes in. The brainstorming, advice we have is I think in line with what a lot of people say. No judgment. Go for quantity, not quality. Don't certainly if you're doing it in a group, don't ever say to somebody, "Well, that's a lousy idea," or "That'll never work." Right? You want to just get down as many ideas as you possibly can. And then after you've done the brainstorm, the model recommends that you go through the process of organizing the results of that brainstorm. And the level of organizing is really going to depend. It'll be driven, I suppose, by the level of squish, right? So depending on how big, how complex, how risky this is feeling, um, the more squish, the more you might feel the need to plan, right? So if you've got a fairly straightforward project, you might end up with a project plan that's really nothing more than a bullet list of things that need to happen in a particular sequence. If it's much more complex, then it might end up being a Gantt chart. Use a piece of software like Microsoft Project or one of that ilk to get the planning done. And then the last thing that the model suggests is identifying next actions. So for each element of the project that you've come up with, and by the way, especially as you're dealing with a project that is quite large in scope, what you might very well find is that there are multiple sub projects. So what you were thinking of as a project has now got multiple elements. In which case, in this last phase, what you'll want to do is make sure that for each one of those elements, those sub elements of the project, that you've got next actions identified. So again, for those of you that weren't familiar, just a quick sort of spin through the natural planning model. It's beyond obviously it's beyond identifying just the next action and just the outcome. It gives you more of a framework for ensuring that you've come at your squishy thing from all potential helpful angles. That's the way I like to think about it.
Yeah, that's great. That's definitely been my experience of it, both with teams and with big individual projects that I'm sort of working on. I think one of the common kind of threads I hear in everything you're saying, you mentioned anytime you identify a gap, your brain helpfully wants to help you fill that gap. And the thing about a gap or is that there's the starting point where you are now, and there is an end point. So by definition, when you have a gap, when you have a desire, there is an end point always. And the way more and more I like to think of it is that for every endpoint, there is some manifestation, some physical manifestation that will signal to you that the gap has been closed. And often that's either, I find, either a physical deliverable, an actual thing that gets created or produced or happens, or it's behavioral, or it's some kind of event. Right? One of those three things, or some combination of those three things, signals the gap has been closed, the goal has been achieved. So an example I think of that's has been kind of squishy actually. The project definition statement for me, the overarching project is something like all associates on the team feel comfortable addressing the implications of this particular type of technology in their seminars. Right? They all feel comfortable. Right? It's actually the outcome is a feeling, is a sense of confidence, is a behavioral ability instilled within those associates. Now there's sub projects under that. There's specific deliverables. There's white papers to write. There's people to talk to. There's consultations to have. There's future engagements with clients to go out and do. And those are specific, very physical manifestations. But there's also the overarching thing is behavioral, right? So with team vision, for example, it may be, everyone understands the vision and we're checking in quarterly to make sure we're all aligned and we have some kind of process for reviewing how we do that to make sure we're still all aligned with the vision and in touch with it. That could de-squish team vision. Or for acquisition strategy, we may have some kind of launch event to announce the acquisition strategy, an event, or we may have some kind of deliverable, a framework that we're actively using for the next 3 evaluations of businesses to acquire, etc. So is there a physical thing? Is there a deliverable? Is there a specific event that's going to happen that's going to cause you to say this is done? Or is there a behavior that's going to change in you or others that's demonstrable, that can be seen? Right? Can someone else from outside go, yeah, that got finished, that got completed, that got delivered? If not, you don't really have a good project definition yet. You need to go back to the natural planning model. You need to go back to doing a brainstorm. You need to go back to potentially others to get information about their vision for what complete looks like, not as a good idea, but as an actual manifestation of something in the world that tells you it's done.
I think that's a really good point and a really good reminder. I love the framework, by the way, of sort of classifying the different types of desired outcomes. I think that's going to be hugely helpful to folks. I think the other thing is, and I'm going to get really concrete and practical now for a minute. I think one of the other questions that comes up is, whatever my planning approach is, if I'm generating artifacts as a result of that, maybe it's a mind map, maybe it's again, maybe just an outline, a project outline that gives me kind of high level tasks, and then lower level actions within that. Whatever it is, what do I do with all of that? And I think that's another question that comes up quite often. I mean, I think for a lot of people, I think they prefer to hold on to that information, even if it's fairly rough, right? Even if it's just sort of, it's a page of notes, right, that I wrote out. That's not client ready by any means, but is a valuable artifact, a valuable recording, history of my thinking on this. And if you do decide that you're going to hold on to that kind of information, I think a really interesting question is, where do you keep it in your system, right? So in most technologies, if you've got a project that's defined, as a task in one piece of software or whatever it's called in your software, assuming you've got a software system, by the way, that there's that there's sort of a notes field where a lot of this stuff can go into. It's not so, from my point of view as a GTD coach, it's not so much for me about which technology you're using. It's, can you, going back to this idea of a good system has clean edges, can you point to the place in your system where that kind of project planning material, we sometimes call it project support material, where does that go in your system? And can you get your hands on it in the future in case you need it? So, so in going through all of this, it sort of comes back to what distracts me, or what potentially distracts me about one of these bigger, squishier things. One of the things that could distract me is, I did all of this thinking. I worked with the team. We ran the project through the natural planning model. We came up with some really good results. We've identified next actions and projects. That all feels good. And then I threw all of that information away, and now I'm distracted because I'm thinking that actually it would have been really helpful to hold on to that. I think I would have been able to make use of it in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the sort of reference management isn't a terribly exciting or scintillating part of the process, but boy, it'll really get you if you don't take good care of it. I think part of what I hear in that too, in the whole process of marching toward what was a squishy goal and now is maybe a bigger thing, like a strategy of some kind or a vision, is that the kind of the corollary to this whole question we ask people about, how can you be kind to your future self when you're clarifying and organizing things? Being kind by making the actions clear, by making the project outcomes a real visible finish line, is something kind of like, how do you set yourself up for success, or how do you set yourself and your team up to win in this particular area and way? And so I think resource management and reference management is actually a really important part of that. Are we sharing this stuff? Where does it go? What's some standards of agreement about how we're going to find what we need when we need it? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but everyone's brain is wired differently, and I file stuff under C for car, and my wife files it under A for auto, and then we got to scramble through the file drawer to find what we need come MOT time. So yes, I think all of these things along the way, being able to think about are we set up for success? Are we structured for success? And it begins, of course, with the de-squishing. But as you point out, it doesn't end there because, in a way, things can, entropy is like the law of the universe we're in, and things will re-squish. Things will become more ragged. Edges will blur and melt and break down as we go along with this, I think, too, unless you continue to make sure you de-squish by asking the questions. How are we storing this stuff? How are we collaborating? What are the principles in play here? Checking in regularly, all these kinds of things. Because stuff returns to squishy. Squishy seems like the natural state, at least of my mind. If I don't put it into the right gear, I don't know. I don't know if you found that too.
I'm with you on that, and I think it's a really good reminder for me, and maybe for folks that I'll go back to the natural planning model for a minute. I introduced it a little while ago as a sequential thing, and it can be used as a sequential thing, right? If you sort of start at the beginning of a project and say, well, we've got this particular issue we want to resolve. Let's flow things through the natural planning model. Then you're just going to go step by step through that. But I think it's worth remembering that the model can be used. You can dip into any element of the model. If you feel like, for example, your outcome is really clear. So what you need to be able to achieve, what's the finish line look like? You feel like that's really clear, but you're missing something about how you're going to make that happen. Well, start at brainstorming, right? Or if you feel like, actually, we feel like we've got all the good ideas out on the table. Sorry, not just the good ideas. We've got all the ideas out on the table, but it doesn't feel like we're organized to make all of that happen, to take those ideas and help to ensure that they're leading us toward the creation of some of the outcome. Then maybe it's time to do a little bit of a deeper dive into organizing. So generally speaking, when it comes to the natural planning model, if you're looking for more control, you want to go, as it were, sequence-wise through the natural planning model, right? So from purpose and principles through to desired outcome, to brainstorming, to organizing, to next actions. And if what you feel like you're lacking is perspective, right? Why are we doing this? What's this all about? Are we all rowing in the same direction? Then that might encourage you to go back up to the first couple of steps in the model. So yeah, again, and I think it really bears repeating. I did a seminar the other day. You and I were talking about this just a minute ago, and what we recommend, right? We do recommend changes in the way that people think about the way that they work, and we recommend, and there's a methodical sort of approach that lies at the core of getting things done. That's all true, and that's all important. But I think ultimately, the gold standard here is not that you've got lists. It's not that you've got a place for your project, project support material. The gold standard is this off my mind, right? Have I done the thinking through that gets me there? And I don't care what approach you're taking. If you get to that, you're in a good place. That's what we're trying to create. So again, it's just, I suppose, a bit of encouragement for those of you who are feeling like, yeah, all fine, but I don't feel like my lists are in a good place based on what I've heard you talk about in terms of GTD. Ultimately, my goal is going to be, hey, are these things off your mind? If that's the case, then you're in a good place.
Yeah, great point, and great to bring it back to the spirit of the thing, because people can often beat themselves up with the details of it. One little thing that's maybe not so little that occurs to me about all of this to mention too is that sometimes things are squishy because our relationship to committing to them is squishy. And if that's the case, if you're not really actively committed to it, or you shouldn't be actively committed to it, you just mentioned the want to do things. And for me, all the want to do things that are sort of nice ideas that aren't really active commitments, those properly belong on my someday maybe list. Those don't belong on a project list as a squishy thing that I'm halfway committed to, but not really. They'll drain my energy. They'll drain my sense of focus and purpose away every time I look at them. So make sure you're committed, and make sure your team is committed, right? And make sure that this really is the priority for, well, we're coming into 2020, right? For this coming year, rather than, oh, we really ought to. We really ought to develop this such and such a strategy. But the reality is all your resources are pointed toward executing on the strategy that you've already put in place, and it's actually going pretty well. But you ought to. I think we should, or I want to, or maybe. Get clear with those things. The first order of clarity is not what's the finish line there. The first order of clarity is, are we really committed to this in the first place? Because if not, no amount of clarity on what ought to be is going to actually motivate you, when the reality is, if you're just really really honest with yourself and the team and the resources available, that should be shelved this year. That should be on the table next year.
I think it's such a good point, Robert, and it's just, I suppose, a reminder of the fact that we talk sometimes about the fact that this work is not for the faint of heart, right? If you get involved in this methodology, if you sort of take on board the principles and follow them, you're going to be face to face with all of your commitments, right? All of your commitments are going to be staring right back at you. And at that point, I think there can be some really challenging thoughts, and if you're involving other people, challenging conversations to have. Have I got too much on, right? Is this really deliverable for me as an individual? And likewise for the team, right? Is the portfolio of outcomes that we've committed to in the next year, the next 6 months, whatever the time frame is that a doable thing? And that's not, and our goal there is not that you create an organization which isn't ambitious and isn't trying to, achieve the things that you think are really important. It's making sure that what you haven't done is lay out a smorgasbord which is so vast that by the end of the year, there's just no way all of these things are going to get done, and therefore you're going to end up being demotivated and demoralized by the fact that you said, yeah, we're going to get these 82 things done in the 52 weeks, and we've got a team of 3 people, and yeah, absolutely, we'll get that done. And then you look back at it, 6 months in, 9 months in, you go, there's just absolutely no way. So again, it's just the idea there is yeah, be ambitious, be strive for overachievement, yeah, by all means, but also be realistic enough that you're not setting yourself up to demotivate yourself and your team.
Yeah, definitely. I always crack up when people, I'm in conversation with them and they say, "Oh, I'll try to get that to you tomorrow. I'll try to do this or I'll try to do that." 95% of the time when they say, "I'll try to," it doesn't happen that day or in that timing or in the way that they said it would. But I don't think I've ever met a GTDer that uses that language that says, "I'm going to try to whatever." They all follow Yoda's sage advice: do or do not. There is no try. Which I love. So yes, but I think we should probably wrap this up. Parting thoughts, top tips to help de-squish the squishy stuff in your life and get it moving and feel good about it and be kind to your future self, Todd.
At the very highest level, number one, do the level of planning to keep planning until you feel like you've gotten it off your mind, and involve the right people. Right. So involve, if it's a planning process that you just can do by yourself, that's fine. If it's something that needs to involve other folks, great. Make sure that they're involved. And then thirdly, just in terms of the actual the holding on to the information that you've created, the artifacts, as I say, that you've created during that process, just know where those are going to go, right? So that you don't have to have the stress that, yeah, I'm not going to be able to, in a sense, stand on the shoulders of my own thinking when I get, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years down the road on this project. If you're going to need to refer back to those artifacts, then make sure you know where they're going to be kept in your system. I don't know. What about you?
No, great stuff. Yeah. And, I would say, to recap, make sure that you're really committed to it. Make sure that it's legit and that that's not part of why the squishiness is there. As you say, ask yourself the hard questions. This isn't for the faint of heart, but the alternative, isn't really a good one at all. Getting clear and getting sharp about this stuff feels great, releases energy, makes you a more effective person. And I think the kind of the other thing on all of this is remember that there are always going to be some manifestation of the squishy thing that's going to tell you the squishy thing is A, no longer squishy, and B, ultimately when you manifest it, it's done. So that could be tangible, that could be behavioral, or that could be event based. But something's going to happen. Something's going to be true that ain't true yet, as we say. That's going to signal to you that this is done. So to me, that's the definition of no longer squishy, is that you've identified at least one of those things. Great stuff. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. As always, do be sure to subscribe to the podcast on audio, whatever your preferred audio method is. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do give us a click on the subscribe button. We do this pretty regularly, and we love also to get your comments and thoughts. So info@next-action.eu is the place to shoot your thoughts and comments and questions. As you can tell, we do address these pretty regularly and really enjoy it. Hopefully this was useful to you, and inspires you to go off and do or do not a bit more and try a bit less. And it's been certainly my pleasure on behalf of Todd, and thanks for listening, thanks for watching, thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time.